we forget is the largest class in society. About 90% of people are working class in this country. But, you know, if you listen to the presidential candidates, they're always talking about the middle class. The middle class are like also known as the petty bourgeoisie, or, you know, small shopkeepers, small businesses. You know, they're important and everybody should have a good life, but they're a tiny fraction of the total society, which is mostly working class. And it's very, very rare that you hear any candidates at any level talking about, I want to do things for the working class. Now they say, I want to do things for the middle class.
That's what we've been told.
And then 3, a desirable but underdeveloped area in the estimation of high income potential residents and developers. So this situation, which I describe in this book, is that you have you know, essentially a beach town which has a strong community, and but is undervalued according to people with money, and so it's a prime target to move in. And there's you know, it doesn't have to be a beach town, but there's areas in every city where you have a traditional group of people who, you know, maybe black or Latino or Polish or you know, who knows what, that have lived there for years and years and very happy with their lives. But you big developers and also finance capitalists look at this, mostly on paper, and say, we could make a lot of money here because not enough, you know, giant buildings or high rent condominiums or apartments or homes. And 4, and I think this one is very important, there's a lack of genuine democracy which would allow residents of a local community to have a say on development and lifestyle. And in my study of the subject, I constantly found that gentrification and lack of democracy went hand in hand. What is democracy to Americans? Well, it's probably that you have an election and somebody wins, probably the favorite candidate, and somebody loses, and that's democracy. So we can hold up our head in the community of nations, right? Because we have real democracy. But real democracy, if you think about it, is that ordinary people have a say in what goes on around them. And that's, you know, missing in so many ways. In most cities, you have a city council that maybe represents millions of people. And each council member, for instance, again in Los Angeles, you have 15 city council members for an area of about 4 million people. Now, how do they transmit democracy to their constituents? There's just too many of them, you know. And so in some areas you have community organizations that have a democratic structure, and people are known by the leaders of the organization and so on. But these organizations very seldom have real power. They can advise, they can protest, they can demand, whatever, but they don't have the authority to do anything. And again in Los Angeles, there was a wave of secession movements in around 2000, 2001, that time. And to forestall these people trying to break off their community from this megalopolis, they came up with something called neighborhood councils, where they divided up to 80 different neighborhood councils. But one thing they did, they put into it that made it somewhat ridiculous. At the behest of the big developers who have always run Los Angeles since it was, you know, back in the 1800s. They were always for expanding the city and building and so on. The big developers told the city council members, who they elect with their money, that under no circumstances could these neighborhood councils have real decision-making power when it came to development or you know, anything that affected their ability to make more money. And so they said, okay, to the neighborhood councils, they said, okay, you can have advisory power. You can tell us what you think, and then we'll do the opposite. But that's the case, I think, in a lot of areas. If they don't have a neighborhood council, they have some sort of pseudo structure that does not give people the right to say, you know, hey, we don't want a hotel right next to our elementary school, or we don't want a high-rise building that's going to block the sunshine for 50 families or whatever. They don't have that authority anywhere in the world and or in the country. So instead, you get a facade of democracy. And I really believe that the only way to, well, first of all, to get rid of gentrification, you got to get rid of neoliberalism, which I think we're all for. But to prevent these kinds of situations from happening, the fight for democracy is extremely important. And it's always been part of the fight of the left in this country, to fight for real working class democracy, right? And that fight, I think, is as important or more important now than it's ever been in the past. Because without democracy, people are just individuals. You may not even know their neighbors, the people who live next door or in the apartment down the hall. And they certainly don't have any long discussions about, hey, what do you think about this community? How can we make it better? What can we do to improve things around here? Because they're forced into this mindset, which the mass media helps a lot in this, that we're all individuals and we don't need other people. We can get rich, really rich, by our own, you know, volition, or by winning the lottery, or who knows what. But you don't need to work with your neighbors or your friends in the community to make it, you know, the kind of place you want. You might want a vacant lot down the street. You might want to turn that into a park, you know, kids' equipment and stuff. You know, people generally don't think in these terms, because the city comes in and they say, well, this is some land we don't need, we're going to sell it to a developer, and they're going to put in some expensive thing that none of you can afford. And that's how that works. So the impact of gentrification on community, and I think this is important. I'll try to finish up pretty quick. First of all, renters are evicted or forced out by large increases of rent. This happens every time there's gentrification. The rents go up, the tenants who live there for years go away. Homeowners are often enticed to sell or move elsewhere by large increases in the market value of their home. For the poor family, the chances of gaining a better standard of living by selling their home are often irresistible. The problem is it's hard to buy anything after you sell your home that's cheaper, you know, but you're probably going to be in a place away from your friends and away from your community. You're not going to know where the store is, you're not going to know the clerks in the hardware store or whatever it is. Both homeowners and renters are subjected to loud construction noise as a large home or commercial building goes up next door. And this may sound trivial compared to some of the other things, but for some people it's a constant racket that goes on for more than a year. You know, one building will be built, and then the next building will be built, and so on. Privacy is restricted with new neighbors who can see into residences' backyards from their third-story windows. So, in addition, natural sunlight is cut off by taller buildings on one or both sides. And you go from a situation where you could, you know, do whatever you want, a barbecue or whatever in your backyard, and nobody would know what you're doing, to somebody looking out of their window that's way above your house and seeing and hearing everything you do. Historic homes are demolished or completely gutted and replaced by modern buildings which concentrate on a pleasing internal ambience while paying little attention to how the new building fits into the community. So you may have, you know, beautiful old houses, and somebody puts up a blockhouse, you know, that really is nice inside, but nobody goes inside except the people who live there. But on the outside, it's a blight on the community. My feeling is that all the great architects are dead, and we only have interior decorators left, because you would think, I asked one developer who in Venice who specialized in these block houses, I said, why don't you ever build like a Victorian house, you know, with all the flourishes and everything? And he said, I don't know how. It's so easy to just slap up a wall, you know, without anything on it. And coming in here today, we saw some buildings, beautiful buildings, but they're not new buildings, but they had all engravings and carvings and stuff like that. And so it's like the best days of architecture definitely seem to be behind us, at least until we get rid of capitalism that causes people to look at how much money they can make, how much profit they can make, rather than how much beauty they can create in a community. Yeah. Okay, people of color are subjected to increased racism from their new upper middle class white neighbors. Many communities, including Venice, you have black and Latinos and whites all living together, and they know each other from years back. They know the parents, the grandparents, and all this. And new people come in, and it would be funny if it wasn't so sad, but sometimes they buy these block houses that are just built, put up a really tall fence, get some pit bulls or other ferocious dogs, and nobody goes near them. You know, their SUVs are in their enclosed garage, so they leave the house, the garage door opens, they pull out, go down the street. Nobody even knows what they look like. You know? And if there's any conflict, like in one park currently, I know has been a gathering place for black children in Venice, and they play soccer or whatever. And the new upper middle class people want to turn it into a dog park. Now, dogs need a place to be, but not where kids are, and not, you know, running the risk of getting bitten, or dogs digging a hole and somebody breaks their leg in it, and, you know, this kind of thing. So you have these clashes where basically the new white, predominantly white neighbors would rather the black people all go away, or the Latino people all go away. Renters and homeowners find that they can no longer afford to live in their old neighborhood. Some of them are added to the homeless population. Not only can they no longer afford to live in their old house or apartment, they can't afford to live anywhere else either. So, you know, I've met people who've been residents for years and ended up homeless because they were evicted from their apartments and had nowhere to go, and they sleep in the alleys or here and there. And that should be against the law. It should be a criminal action to force people onto the streets and to leave them there. You know, even here on Berkeley, where it meets the 580 or the 80,
Yeah.
you know, you have an encampment where people live in the tent, which is better than just sleeping on the sidewalk, I guess. You know, there's gradations here. But how can the government allow this? How can, you know, the people with money allow this to happen and not care about it? The psychological trauma of moving, particularly forced relocation, affects everyone. Children and elders are particularly susceptible to long-term trauma. So we had a mass eviction in Venice, which detail in the first chapter of my book, where people were forced out. It was the biggest eviction in LA history, and there was no place nearby where they could get a rent-controlled apartment, you know, because in California, with the post-Hawkins law, you have vacancy decontrol, which means as soon as somebody moves out, they can raise the rent sky high. And so there was two sisters who were in their 90s, and they had to move to San Bernardino, which, if you know anything about LA, it's like 70 miles away under the smog. And one died a year later, and the other one died a couple years later. And they'd probably still be alive if they had not been forced out of their neighborhood, the community, and their friends and everything else. Lifetime friends and neighbors lose contact as they move to different locations. We had a diaspora of people going away. Now, the happy ending was that we were able to, by community pressure, force the reversal of the eviction, and 55 families were able to come back in at their previous rent. But meanwhile, people had died, people had become homeless and gotten lost, and like the two sisters I just mentioned, there's no way they could come back. The effects of gentrification on the whole community can be as devastating as the effects on a single individual. And by this I mean that every one of us contributes something to the community we live in, some more than others, but the sum total is that, you know, we all are responsible and add to the pleasure of a community where people have some sort of relationship, you know, if it's just nodding at their neighbors. And if you take away a big group of these people because of gentrification, the whole community suffers. And the shops maybe were just eking out a living, and then there's a whole group of missing people who don't do their own home repairs and go to the local hardware store. And so the hardware store closes, some high-end fashion store goes in or something else, and the whole community changes. Locally owned businesses are replaced with chain stores which don't cater to the community, instead seeking a wider market. Local coffee house might be replaced by a Starbucks, but the hardware store and laundromat may not be replaced at all. So things that poor people need, like a laundromat, they might have to go miles to find another one. And finally, the unique aspect of a community's culture ends up as a historical footnote when gentrification is successful. In Venice's case, art and poetry are at risk when artists and poets can no longer live in the neighborhood that gives them inspiration. Nor can they exhibit their art or read their poetry when small venues have been turned into high-end clothing stores or restaurants. So again, the effect on the community is certainly devastating. So obviously with, one last thing I wanted to mention, and then I think this might be a source of comment. I often hear people say, well, if we have another 4 years of Trump, we're going to have fascism. Or, you know, we have Bush gets another term, we're going to have fascism or whatever. Well, what's the validity of that? I would contend that for many people in this country, poor people, people of color, have been living under fascism for years. And it's only middle-class people, upper-middle-class people, wealthy people who live in a democracy. And this is one of the really sad things about a capitalist country, is that you have a underclass, more or less, that is subject to arrests by the police for no good reason, for killings of black people in the streets of every city in the country, of people who are constantly under suspicion or watched by police. And you have, of course, the prison industrial complex, which is what happens if you are not acceptable to the local repressive organs of state, which are as repressive, I would say, as many fascistic countries. You know, if you're upper middle class, even middle class, or higher, you don't really have to worry about these things. You know, if you get stopped for your license plate fell off or something like that, the cop will probably give you a warning. If you're black or Latino, you're headed for jail until they can check you out, you know. And so I would say, you know, we have a dangerous situation here where part of the society is fascist, part of it is democratic, and in recent years the fascist part has been increasing. So when are we going to have fascism? Well, it really depends on where you fit in the class alignment, because some of us, you know, have fascism, some of us have democracy, and you know, the people who basically are free are the ones who can pay for it, and that's not any way to live. So gentrification is a very important part of this whole sick society that we live in, which is called capitalism or neoliberalism, and it's something which all of us should take part in if there's some kind of gentrification struggle in your community or nearby. Please take part in it. My reason for writing this book was to try to give some tools to people who were confronting gentrification. And it took me a couple years to write, and it's 450 pages, so it's not a cheap book. It's normally $25. I got them discounted for 20 today, but what I'd really like to do is give in libraries where people can go and read them for free. You know, remember libraries? we still have libraries in this country, fortunately, and, even if they're not open all the time. So if any of you can find a library that could use this book, let me know through Gene, and I will send them a free copy for if they will make it available to people in their community, because there's no reason why we should just be run over by the rich. We're collectively are much smarter than the rich and the developers, and if we have the tools and can work together in groups, then we can turn this around and everything else in the country that we don't like. So with that, I want to end here because I get to do this for a long time, and we'll have a discussion.
We're all inspired to go out there and take up arms against a sea of troubles. But before we do, first step, of course,